Buford's troopers back across Willoughby Run by now and in position on McPherson's Ridge fired their carbines rapidly as the butternut riflemen came at them down the east side of Hare Ridge. But it was obvious to their general, who had a good view of the scene from the cupola of a Lutheran seminary on the crest of the next Rearwood Ridge, about midway between Gettysburg and the one they were defending, a mile from town, that his 2 brigades of dismounted men, 1 out of 4 of whom had to stay behind to hold the horses of the other 3, were not going to be able to hang on long in the face of all that power. Moreover, reports had reached him from outposts he had established to the north toward Heidlersburg that substantial rebel forces were advancing from there as well. Unless Federal infantry came up soon and in strength, he would have to pull out to avoid being swamped from both directions. At about 8:30, however, as he started down the ladder, perhaps to give the order to retire, he heard a calm voice asking from below, "What's the matter, John?" It was Reynolds, whom many considered not only the highest ranking but also the best general in the army. Buford shook his head. "The devil's to pay," he said, and he came on down the ladder. But when Reynolds asked if this meant he could not hang on till the First Corps got there, most likely within an hour, the cavalryman said he reckoned he could. At any rate, he'd try. That was enough for Reynolds. He sent at once for Howard and Sickles, urging haste on the march to join him, then turned to an aide and gave him a verbal message for Meade at Taneytown. "Tell him the enemy are advancing in strong force, and that I fear they will get to the heights beyond the town before I can. I will fight them inch by inch, and if driven into the town, I will barricade the streets and hold them back as long as possible." He himself rode back to bring up Wadsworth's division, which was leading the march up the Emmitsburg Road, and guided it cross-country over Seminary Ridge and up the Chambersburg Pike toward McPherson's Ridge, where by now, after 2 full hours of fighting, Buford's troopers were approaching both the crest of the ridge uphill in their rear and the limit of their endurance. Reynolds directed one of Wadsworth's 2 brigades to the right and the other to the left to bolster the cavalry and oppose the rebel infantry coming at them. The race was close. He knew that unless he hurried, he would lose it. Already the time was past 10 o'clock, and he could see Confederates among the trees of an apple orchard just to the left of where the pike went out of sight beyond the ridge. He turned in the saddle and called back over his shoulder to the infantry trudging behind him. "Forward! Forward, men! Drive those fellows out of that! Forward! For God's sake, forward!" Those were his last words. He suddenly toppled from his horse and lay quite still, face down on the soil of his native Pennsylvania. No one knew what had hit him, including Reynolds himself most likely, until an aide saw the neat half-inch hole behind his right ear where the rifle bullet had struck. When they turned him over, he gasped once, then smiled, but that was all. He was dead at the age of 42, brought down by a rebel marksman in the orchard just ahead. "His death affected us much," a young lieutenant later wrote, "for he was one of the soldier generals of the Army." Beyond the ridge, Heath had decided by now that the time had come for him to press the issue with more than skirmishes. He passed the word, and Davis and Archer went in with their main bodies left and right of the turnpike, intending to overrun the rapid-firing blue troopers spread out on the slope before them. Archer's men were thrown into some disorder by a fence they had to climb just west of Willoughby Run, but at last they got over and splashed across the stream. As they started up McPherson's Ridge, however, the woods along the crest were suddenly filled with flame, stab, smoke, and the crash of heavy volleys. This was musketry, not sporadic carbine fire, and then they saw why. Not only were these new opponents infantry, but their black hats told the startled and stalled attackers that this was the Iron Brigade, made up of hard-bitten Westerners with a formidable reputation for hard fighting and a fierce pride in their official designation as the 1st Brigade of the 1st Division of the 1st Corps of the 1st Army of the Republic. Staggered by the ambush and outnumbered as they were, the butternut survivors perceived that the time had come to get out of there, and that was what they did. Splashing back across the stream, however, they piled up again at the high fence and were struck heavily on the outer flank by a Michigan regiment that had worked its way around through the woods to the south. Most got over, but about 75 Confederates were captured while awaiting their turn at the fence, including Archer, who was grabbed and mauled by a hefty private named Patrick Maloney. Exuberant over the size of his catch, as well he might be, no general in Lee's army had ever been captured before. Maloney turned Archer over to his captain, who refused to accept the sword that was offered in formal surrender. "Keep your sword, General, and go to the rear," he told him. "One sword is all I need on this line." A staff lieutenant who had taken no part in the fighting did not see it that way, however, and insisted on having the trophy, even after the prisoner explained that it had been declined by the man who was entitled to it. Archer was furious, not only at this, but also because of the roughing up the big Irishman had given him, which accounted in part for his reaction when he was presented to Doubleday, who had succeeded Reynolds as corps commander. "Archer, I'm glad to see you," the New Yorker cried, striding forward with his hand out. They had been friends in the old army, but apparently that meant nothing to Archer now. "Well, I'm not glad to see you by a damn sight," he said coldly, and he kept his hand at his side. North of the turnpike, the other half of Heath's attack had better success, at least at the start. Though Reynolds, even in death, had won his race on the Union left, where the Iron Brigade arrived in time to prepare for what was coming, the brigade on the right not only had a longer way to go, and consequently less time for getting set, it also found no covering woods along that stretch of McPherson's Ridge. Davis's men, 5 regiments, scraped together from the Richmond defenses and the Carolina littoral, none of whom had worked together previously, and only 2 of which had ever fought in Virginia, could see what lay before them, and they advanced with all the eagerness of green troops glad of a chance to demonstrate their mettle. One of the 5 was a North Carolina outfit whose colonel went down early in the charge, shot as he took up the fallen colors, and when another tall heel officer bent over him to ask if he was badly hurt, he replied, "Yes, but pay no attention to me. Take the colors and keep ahead of the Mississippians." By then the whole line was going in on the double. On the crest ahead, the Federals wavered, and then, as Wadsworth sought to forestall a rout by ordering a withdrawal, fell back hastily toward Seminary Ridge. Davis was elated. The president's nephew, he was aware of muttered complaints of nepotism, and he was happy to be proving his worth and his right to the wreathed stars on his collar. Yelling in anticipation of coming to grips with the fleeing bluecoats, the attackers swept over the crest of McPherson's Ridge and into the quarter-mile-wide valley beyond. There they funneled into the deep cut of an unfinished railroad bed which seemed to offer an ideal covered approach to the Federal rear, but which, in fact, turned out to be a trap. Once in, they found the sides of the cut so high and steep that they could not fire out, and Doubleday, spotting the opportunity, quickly took advantage of it by sending 2 regiments over from south of the pike, where Archer had just been routed. "Throw down your muskets! Throw down your muskets!" the men in the cut heard voices calling from overhead, and they looked up into the muzzles of rifles slanted down at them from the rim above. Caught thus in a situation not unlike that of fish in a rain barrel, some 250 graybacks surrendered outright, dropping their weapons where they stood, while casualties were heavy among those who chose to attempt escape by running the gauntlet westward. The reversal was complete. Davis and his survivors fell back across McPherson's Ridge, profoundly shaken by the sudden frown of fortune and considerably reduced from the strength they'd enjoyed when they first came whooping over the crest, headed in the opposite direction. Here on the Confederate left, after so brave a beginning, the attackers had wound up with an even worse disaster than had been suffered on the right. Though Davis himself, unlike Archer, had avoided capture, a good half of his men had either been taken prisoner or shot, and the rest were too demoralized to be of any present use at all. Doubleday was as elated as Davis had been a short while back. Moreover, his hard-won feeling of security was strengthened by the arrival of the other 2 divisions of the Corps, his own and Robinson's, and close on their heels came Howard, riding in advance of his own corps, which was coming fast and would be there within an hour. 11 years younger than 44-year-old Doubleday, Howard assumed command of the field by virtue of his seniority. While the skirmish of both armies kept up a racket down in the valley, banging away at each other from opposite banks of Willoughby Run, he reinforced Wadsworth on McPherson's Ridge and continued the long-range artillery duo with rebel batteries on Hare Ridge. It was noon by now. The 11th Corps was arriving under Schurz, and the lines were much the same as they'd been 4 hours ago when Buford's dismounted troopers were all that held them. Unquestionably, there were a great many butternut soldiers on the field. You could see them plainly across the valley, forming in continuous double lines of battle, a staff man noted, adding that as a spectacle it was striking. But Howard believed he was ready for whatever came his way. Sickles ought to be arriving soon, and he had sent for Slocum as well. That would give him 5 more divisions, a total of 11, perhaps by nightfall. Just then, however, a shell burst in rear of the Union center, followed quickly by another and another, all with such startling accuracy that one regimental commander sent an angry complaint that the supporting guns were firing short. But those were not friendly shells dropped in error. They were Confederate. A mile north of the Chambersburg Pike, the two eastern ridges merged at a dominant height called Oak Hill, and there an enemy battery was in action, signaling danger to the Federal right, which extended only about half that distance. Coming south across the fields around Oak Hill, directly toward the vulnerable flank, was another gray flood of rebel infantry. One-armed Howard, knowing he had to move fast to meet the threat, bent the north end of Doubleday's line back east to stride Seminary Ridge and hurried the first 2 divisions of his own corps across the rolling farmland north of Gettysburg with instructions for Schurz to form a new line there at right angles to the first. They barely had time to arrive before the storm burst. This new great pressure was brought to bear by Rhodes. Like Heath, he was going into battle for the first time as a major general, and just as his fellow Virginian had faced the test without his corps commander at hand to advise him, so too was Rhodes on his own, not because Ewell lay sick in his tent, as had been the case with Hill, but because he preferred to ride near the tail of the column in his buggy. Old Baldhead was in a strange mood anyhow, confused by discretionary orders and aggrieved by the sudden abandonment of his advance on Harrisburg, just as he had the place within his grasp. At Middletown that morning, confronted with the necessity for choosing between his alternate objectives, he had had his mind made up for him at last by a note from Hill informing him that the 3rd Corps was on its way to Gettysburg. So he had directed Rhodes to take the left fork, which led there. Besides, there seemed a convenient point for a junction with Early, who was marching from the west, while Johnson, off to the east with the train, could join him there by turning east when he reached Cashtown. By nightfall, the Corps would be reunited for the first time in a week, but until then, Ewell preferred to allow all 3 division commanders to function independently. Rhodes no doubt appreciated the confidence this implied. At any rate, hearing heavy firing up ahead at noon, he quickened the pace and reached Oak Hill about 1:30 to find a golden opportunity spread before him. On parallel ridges extending south from where he stood, Confederates and Federals were disposed in an attitude not unlike that of 2 animals who had just met and scrapped and then drawn back, still growling, for a better assessment of each other before coming to grips again. What attracted Rhodes at first glance was the fact that the enemy flank, half a mile down the eastern ridge, was wide open to an oblique attack from the road along which his division was advancing. He would have to move fast, however, for already the near end of the Union line was beginning to curl back in response to his appearance, and reinforcements were pouring in large numbers from the streets of Gettysburg, taking up positions from which to defend it. This last was quite all right with Rhodes. It was not the town he wanted dead ahead, it was the blue force on the ridge to his right front. Accordingly, after posting one of his 5 brigades out to the left with instructions to hold off the still arriving defenders of the town in case they went over to the offensive, which they well might do, their number by now was larger than his own, he held another brigade in reserve and put the remaining 3 in line abreast, facing south for a charge against the flank of the bluecoats on the ridge. All this was quickly done with no time spared for a preliminary reconnaissance or even the advancement of a skirmish line. About 2 o'clock, the alignment had been completed, and Rhodes gave his 3 attack brigades the order to go forward. They did go forward, but into chaos. Left on its own by the other 2 brigades, one stalled at the outset, the other drifted wide, the center brigade stepped in mid-stride into slaughter when a line of Federals, hit until then, rose from behind a low stone wall diagonal to the front and killed or wounded about half of the advancing men with a series of point-blank volleys pumped directly into their flank. Such was the price they paid for the time Rhodes saved by foregoing a reconnaissance. The survivors hit the ground alongside the fallen, some making futile attempts to return the decimating fire, while others began waving scraps of cloth in token of surrender. Observing this, their shaken commander, Alfred Everson, sent word to Rhodes that one whole regiment had raised the white flag and gone over to the enemy on first contact. Though Rhodes did not credit the hysterical report, he saw only too clearly that he had the makings of a first-class disaster on his hands. Like Heath to the south, he had paid in disproportionate blood for the ready aggressiveness which in the past had been the hallmark of the Army's greatest victories, but which now seemed mere rashness and the hallmark of defeat. It had been so for the captured Archer and for Davis, and now it was the same for Everson, who was so demoralized by what he had seen, or thought he had seen, that he had to turn over to his adjutant the task of trying to extricate his shattered regiments. It was at this critical juncture that Lee drew near. Riding through the mountains east of Chambersburg that morning, he had heard the rumble of guns in the distance and wondered what it meant. Hill, who had risen from his sick bed at the sound, pale and feeble though he was, and called for his horse in order to go forward and investigate, could tell Lee nothing more than he already knew, namely, that Heath had marched on Gettysburg with Pender in support, nor could Anderson, whose division was just beyond Cashtown and within half a dozen miles of the ominous booming. Despite repeated warnings that a general engagement was to be avoided until the Army was reunited, the noise up ahead was too loud, or anyhow too sustained, for a mere skirmish. Moreover, Lee was aware of Napoleon's remark that at certain edgy times a dogfight could bring on a battle, and it seemed to him that with his infantry groping its way across unfamiliar, hostile terrain in an attempt to perform the proper function of cavalry, this might well be one of those times. He was worried, and he said so. "I cannot think what has become of Stuart," he told Anderson. "I ought to have heard from him long before now. He may have met with disaster, but I hope not." As he spoke, he gazed up the road where the guns continued to rumble beyond the horizon. "In the absence of reports from him, I am in ignorance of what we have in front of us here. It may be the whole Federal Army, or it may be only a detachment. If it is the whole Federal force, we must fight a battle here." For once he did not seem pleased at the prospect of combat, and he spoke of a withdrawal before he knew what lay before him. "If we do not gain a victory, those defiles and gorges which we passed this morning will shelter us from disaster." And having used the word disaster twice within less than a minute, he hurried ahead, as Hill had done before him, to see for himself what grounds there might be for such forebodings. About 2:30, after passing through Pender's division, which was formed for attack on both sides of the pike but was so far uncommitted, he ascended Hare Ridge to find the smoky panorama of a battle spread before him, a battle he had neither sought nor wanted. Heath had 3 brigades in line on the slope giving down upon Willoughby Run, and Lee now learned that he had attacked some 3 hours earlier, due east and on a mile-wide front, only to encounter Federal infantry whose presence he had not even suspected until he saw what was left of his 2 attack brigades streaming back from a bloody repulse. Since then, belatedly mindful of the warning not to bring on a battle, he had contented himself with restoring his shattered front while engaging the enemy guns in a long-range contest. Lee could see for himself the situation that had developed. Across the way, disposed along the 2 parallel ridges that intervened between the one on which he stood and Gettysburg, plainly visible 2 miles to the southeast, the Federals confronted Heath in unknown strength, their right flank withdrawn sharply in the direction of the town, from whose streets more bluecoats were pouring in heavy numbers in order to meet the new Confederate threat from the north. This was Rhodes, just arrived from Heidelberg, Lee was told, and though his attack was opportune, catching the bluecoats end on and almost unawares, he was making little headway because he'd launched it in a disjointed fashion. At that point, Heath came riding up, having heard that Lee was on the field. Anxious to make up for a slipshod beginning, he appealed to the commanding general to let him go back in. "Rhodes is heavily engaged," he said. "Had I not better attack?" Lee was reluctant. "No," he said slowly, continuing to sweep the field with his glasses. It was not that he lacked confidence in Heath, who was not only a fellow Virginian and a distant cousin, but was also the only officer in the Army, aside, of course, from his own sons, whom he addressed by his first name. It was because Lee still had no real notion of the enemy's strength, except that it was obviously considerable, and he was by no means willing to risk the apparent likelihood of expanding a double into a triple repulse. "No," he said again, more decisively than before, "I am not prepared to bring on a general engagement today. Longstreet is not up." But suddenly his mind was changed by what he saw before him. Rodes's right brigade, after drifting wide, came down hard on the critical angle where the Union line bent east, and his reserve brigade, committed after the wreck of Everson, dislodged the Federals from their position behind the diagonal stone wall, while his left brigade recovered momentum and plunged into a quarter-mile gap between the two blue corps, north and west of Gettysburg. Assailed and outflanked, the eastward extension of Doubleday's line began to crumble as the men who had held it retreated stubbornly down Seminary Ridge. Simultaneously, Howard's two divisions under Schurz, his own now led by Alexander Schimmelpfennig, and Barlow's, the third, von Steinwehr's, had been left in reserve on the other side of the town, were assaulted by a new gray force that came roaring down the Harrisburg Road. It was Early, arriving from York, to strike their right at the moment when Rodes was probing the gap beyond their left. As a result, this line too began to crumble, but much faster than the other. On Hare Ridge, Lee saw much of this through his binoculars, blind chance having reproduced in miniature the conditions of Second Manassas, with Chancellorsville thrown in for good measure. He dropped his unaccustomed cloak of caution and told Hill, who rode up just then, to send both Heath and Panda forward to sweep the field. They did just that, but only after fierce and bloody fighting, particularly on McPherson's Ridge south of the pike, where the Iron Brigade was posted. Unleashed at last, Heath's men went splashing across Willoughby Run and up the opposite slope, to and finally over the fuming crest. Heath himself did not make it all the way, having been unhorsed by a fragment of shell which struck him on the side of the head, knocked him unconscious, and probably would have killed him too, except that the force of the blow was absorbed in part by a folded newspaper tucked under the sweatband of a too-large hat acquired the day before in Cashtown. Hundreds of others in both armies were not so fortunate. Told by Doubleday to maintain his position at all costs, Solomon Meredith, commander of the Iron Brigade, came close to following these instructions to the letter, although he himself, like Heath, was knocked out before the action was half over. The 24th Michigan, for example, had come onto the ridge with 496 officers and men. It left with 97. This loss of just over 80% was exceeded only by the regiment that inflicted it, Pettigrew's 26th North Carolina, whose two center companies set new records for battlefield losses that would never be broken here or elsewhere. One took 83 soldiers into the fight and emerged with only 2 unhit, while the other went in with 91, and all were killed or wounded. Panda, sent forward by Hill as the struggle approached a climax, overlapped the south flank of the defenders and added the pressure that forced them off the ridge. The men of the Iron Brigade fell back at last, 600 of them at any rate, for twice that many were casualties out of the original 1,800, ending the brief half-hour of concentrated fury. "I have taken part in many hotly contested fights," Pettigrew's adjutant later declared, "but this, I think, was the deadliest of them all." Coming up in the wake of the attack, he heard dreadful howls in the woods on the ridge, and when he went over to investigate, he found that the source of the racket was the wounded of both sides. Several were foaming at the mouth as though mad, and seemed not even to be aware that they were screaming. He attributed their reaction to the shock of having been exposed to quick, frightful conflict following several hours of suspense. Across the way, Ewell's 2 divisions were having a much easier time than Hill's. While Rodes was pressing Doubleday steadily southward down Seminary Ridge, widening the gap on the left of the line Schurz had drawn north of the town, Early struck hard at the far right of the Union front, which was exposed to just such a blow as the one that had crumpled that same flank at Chancellorsville 2 months ago tomorrow. Most of the men opposing him had been through that experience, and now that they foresaw a repetition of it, they reacted in the same fashion. They broke and ran, first by 1s and 2s, then by squads and platoons, and finally by companies and regiments. They forgot that they had welcomed the chance to refute in action the ugly things the rest of the army had been saying about them, Instead, they took off rearward in headlong flight. Barlow, a 29-year-old New York lawyer who had finished first in his class at Harvard and volunteered at the start of the war as a private in a militia company, tried desperately to rally the division he had commanded for less than 6 weeks, but was shot from his horse and left for dead on the field. His men were quitting. It was otherwise with Schimmelpfennig, a former Prussian officer 10 years older than Barlow and presumably that much wiser. He went along with the rush of his troops all the way into Gettysburg, until he too was unhorsed by a stray bullet while clattering down a side street, and took refuge in a woodshed, where he remained in hiding for the next 3 days. Yelling with pleasure at the sight of the blue flood running backward across the fields as if the landscape had been tipped, the rebel pursuers cut down and gathered in fugitives by the hundreds, all at comparatively small cost to themselves, since but little of their fire was being returned. "General, where are your dead men?" an elated young officer called to John B. Gordon, whose 6 Georgia regiments had led the charge that threw the Bluecoats into retreat before contact was established. Still intent on the pursuit, Gordon did not pause for an answer. "I haven't got any, sir," he shouted as he rode past on his black stallion. "The Almighty has covered my men with his shield and buckler." Lee observed from atop Hare Ridge the sudden climax of this latest addition to his year-long string of victories. Riding forward in the wake of Pender's exultant attack, which was delivered with the cohesive, smashing power of a clenched fist, he crossed McPherson's Ridge, thickly strewn with the dead and wounded of both armies, and mounted the opposite slope just as the Federals abandoned a fitful attempt to make a stand around the seminary. Ahead of him, down the remaining half-mile of the Chambersburg Pike, they were retreating pell-mell into the streets of Gettysburg, already jammed with other blue troops pouring down from the north under pressure from Ewell, as into a funnel whose spout extended south. Those who managed to struggle free of the crush and thus emerged from the spout were running hard down 2 roads that led steeply up a dominant height where guns were emplaced and the foremost of the fugitives were being brought to a halt, apparently for still another stand. Cemetery Hill it was called because of the graveyard on its lofty plateau half a mile from the town square. Another half-mile to the east, about 2 miles from where Lee stood, there was a second eminence, Culp's Hill, slightly higher than the first, to which it was connected by a saddle of rocky ground, similarly precipitous and forbidding. These 2 hills, their summits 100 feet above the town, which in turn was about half that far below the crest of Seminary Ridge, afforded the enemy a strong position, indeed a natural fortress, on which to rally his whipped and panicky troops, especially if time was allowed for the steadily increasing number of defenders to improve with their spades the already formidable advantages of terrain. Lee could see for himself, now that he had what amounted to a ringside view of the action, that his victory had been achieved more as a result of tactical good fortune than because of any great preponderance of numbers, which in fact he did not have. Prisoners had been taken from 2 Union corps, 6 divisions in all, and they reported that the rest of the Blue Army was on the march to join them from bivouacs close at hand. Some 25,000 attackers, just under half of Lee's infantry, had faced 20,000 defenders, just over 1/4 of Meade's, and the resultant casualties had done little to change the overall ratio of the 2 armies on and off the field. Nearly 8,000 Confederates had fallen and been captured, as compared to 9,000 Federals, about half of whom had been taken prisoner. It was clear that if the tactical advantage was not pressed, it might soon be lost altogether. First, by giving the rattled Bluecoats a chance to recompose themselves, they on the dominant heights just south of town, and second, by allowing time for the arrival of heavy reinforcements already on the way. Moreover, both of these reasons for continuing the offensive were merely adjunctive to Lee's natural inclination, here as elsewhere, now as always, to keep a beaten opponent under pressure and thus off balance, just as long as his own troops had wind and strength enough to put one foot in front of the other. Ill though he was, ghostly pale and very delicate, as one observer remarked, A.P. Hill was altogether in agreement that the new Federal position had to be carried if the victory was to be completed. But when Lee turned to him there on Seminary Ridge and proposed that the 3rd Corps make the attack, little Powell declined. Anderson's division was still miles away. Heath's was shattered, the commander himself unconscious, and Penda's blown and disorganized by its furious charge and wild pursuit. The survivors were close to exhaustion, and so was their ammunition, which would have to be replenished from the train back up the pike. Regretfully, Hill replied that his men were in no condition for further exertion just now, and Lee, knowing from past experience that Hill invariably required of him all that flesh could endure, was obliged to accept his judgment. That left Ewell. Rhodes had been roughly handled at the outset, it was true, but Early was comparatively fresh, had suffered only light casualties in driving the skittish Dutchman from the field, and was already on the march through the streets of the town, rounding up herds of prisoners within half a mile of the proposed objective. Besides which, it seemed fitting that the Second Corps continue its Jacksonian tradition of hard-legged mobility and terrific striking power demonstrated recently at Winchester, a month after Stonewall was laid to rest nearby in the Shenandoah Valley, and re-demonstrated here today in Pennsylvania. Having made the decision, Lee gave a staff officer oral instructions to take to Ewell. As usual, not being in a position to judge for himself the condition of the troops or the difficulties the objective might present when approached from the north, he made the order discretionary. Ewell was to carry the hill occupied by the enemy if he found it practicable, so Lee paraphrased the instructions afterwards in his formal report, but to avoid a general engagement until the arrival of the other divisions of the Army. That was about 4:30. Barely an hour had passed since Hill threw Penda into the follow-up attack on Seminary Ridge, sweeping it clear of defenders within less than half an hour, and a good 4 hours of daylight remained for Ewell's follow-up attack on Cemetery Hill, which would complete the victory by annihilating or driving the survivors from the scene before Meade could accomplish his convergence there. Presently, as Lee continued to search the field for signs that the intended attack was underway, Longstreet arrived, riding well in advance of his troops, who had marked time short of Cashtown all morning, under instructions to yield a single eastward road to Johnson, who was hurrying to join the other divisions of the Second Corps. While Lee explained what had happened so far today and pointed out the hill aswarm with bluecoats across the valley, old Peter took out his binoculars and made a careful examination of the front. A broad, low ridge, parallel to and roughly 3/4 of a mile east of the one on which he stood, extended 2 miles southward from Cemetery Hill to a pair of conical heights, the nearer of which, called Little Round Top, was some 50 feet taller than the occupied hill to the north, while the farther, called simply Round Top, was more than 100 feet taller still. On the map, and in the minds of students down the years, this complex of high ground south of Gettysburg conformed in general to the shape of a fishhook, with Round Top as the eye, Cemetery Ridge as the shank, Cemetery Hill as the bend, and Culp's Hill as the barb. Neither of the dominant heights to the south appeared to have been occupied yet by the enemy, though it was fairly clear that either would afford the Federals another rallying point in the event of another retreat. However, if this bothered Lee, he did not show it as he stood waiting for Ewell to open the attack from the north. Certainly it did not bother Longstreet, who had the look of a man whose prayers had been answered. Completing his survey of the field, he lowered his glasses, turned to his chief, and declared with evident satisfaction that conditions were ideal for pursuing the offensive-defensive campaign on which he presumed they had agreed before they left Virginia. If we could have chosen a point to meet our plans of operation, he said, I do not think we could have found a better one than that upon which they are now concentrating. All we have to do is throw our army around by their left, and we shall interpose between the Federal Army and Washington. We can get a strong position and wait, and if they fail to attack us, we shall have everything in condition to move back tomorrow night in the direction of Washington, selecting beforehand a good position into which we can place our troops to receive battle next day. Finding our object is Washington and that army, the Federals will be sure to attack us. When they attack, we shall beat them as we proposed to do before we left Fredericksburg, and the probabilities are that the fruits of our success will be great. The Southern commander's reaction to this proposed surrender of the initiative to Meade was immediate and decisive. No, he said, and gestured with his fist in the direction of Cemetery Hill as he spoke. The enemy is there, and I'm going to attack him there. If he is there, old Peter countered, unimpressed, it'll be because he's anxious that we should attack him. a good reason in my judgment for not doing so. Lee still did not agree. He'd made an auspicious beginning on his plan for toppling the Federal units piecemeal as they came up like a row of dominoes, and he was determined to go ahead with it. No, he said again, they are there in position, and I'm going to whip them or they're going to whip me. For the present, Longstreet let it go at that, observing that his chief was in no frame of mind to listen to further argument. But he resolved to return to the subject as soon as Lee had simmered down. In defensive warfare he was perfect, he wrote years later. When the hunt was up, his combativeness was overruling. Just then a courier arrived with a message from Ewell sent before the one from Lee had reached him. Rhodes and Early believed they could take Cemetery Hill, he reported, if Hill would attack it simultaneously from the west. Lee replied that he was unable to furnish this support except by long-range artillery fire, and after repeating his instructions for Ewell to take the height alone, if possible, added that he would ride over presently to see him. Once more Longstreet spoke up. Minute by minute he'd watched the number of bluecoats increasing on the hill, while those already there were making the dirt fly as they worked at improving the natural strength of the position. He was still opposed to the attack, he said, but if it was going to be made at all, it had better be made at once. Lee did not reply to this immediately. Instead, after sending the courier back to Ewell, he asked where the 1st Corps divisions were by now. McLaws was a couple of miles this side of Cashtown, old Peter replied, with Hood somewhere behind him awaiting road space on the pike. When Lee explained that he could not risk a general assault until these fresh units arrived, Longstreet again fell silent. Whether in agreement or disagreement he did not say, and soon rode off, apparently to hasten the march of the column whose head was half a dozen miles away. It was now past 5:30, and the guns had stopped their growling on both sides. The staff officer returned to report that he delivered the hour-old message to Ewell, but there was no other evidence that it had been received. Down below, the streets of the town were still crowded with Confederates, busy flushing Union fugitives out of cellars and back alleys, and there was no sign whatsoever that Ewell was preparing to launch the attack he'd twice been told to make if he believed it would be successful. Meantime, the sun was dropping swiftly down the sky, and the survivors of the 2 Blue Corps were hard at work improving their defenses. One welcome interruption there was in the form of a pair of Stuart's troopers who brought word to Seminary Ridge of the skirmish near Hanover the day before, the fruitless grope toward York, and the subsequent decision to push on to Carlisle. Relieved to learn that Jeb had managed to avoid personal disaster, whatever trouble he might have made for others, Lee told the horsemen to ride the 30 miles north at once, with orders for the cavalry to rejoin the army as soon as possible. That could not be sooner than tomorrow, of course, but at least he could anticipate removal of the blindfold he had worn throughout the week of Stuart's absence. Near 7 o'clock, with sunset half an hour away and full darkness a good hour beyond that, which left just time enough perhaps for launching the attack on Cemetery Hill, Lee mounted Traveler and rode toward Gettysburg, intending not only to pay Ewell the visit he had promised, but also to discover for himself the reason for the long delay.